It was the kind of night when silence felt heavier than words, the air outside dry and restless, and the rancher's lantern cast long, trembling shadows across the wooden floor of his small, weathered home. His life had never been easy. Hard, soil, lean harvests, and the burden of debts that seemed to grow heavier with each passing season. Yet despite his poverty, he carried within him a stubborn streak of kindness that often outweighed his caution, and it was that very kindness which would soon lead him into a moment so extraordinary, so unimaginable, that it would change the way he saw the world forever. That evening, he stood at the door, staring out into the darkness. Beyond the crooked fence of his ranch, the wind carried faint sounds, snorts, stomps, and the shifting of heavy hooves. He squinted, rubbed his tired eyes, and wondered if hunger and exhaustion were playing tricks on his mind. But when the sound grew louder, when the earth beneath his boots seemed to shiver, he knew it wasn't his imagination. Out from the shadows emerged a figure so massive that for a moment he forgot to breathe. It wasn't just a horse, it was a giant horse, towering over the gate like a creature out of forgotten legends. And beside it, nudging against its legs, were two foals, their coats glistening faintly in the moonlight. For a man who barely had enough to feed himself, the sight of 3 hungry animals should have been a reason to turn them away. His cupboards were close to empty, his barns near collapse, his pockets filled only with dust. But there was something in their eyes, something pleading, something so alive, that pulled at him. The foals trembled from the chill of the night. The giant horse shifted its weight, snorting clouds into the cold air, its gaze fixed on him as though asking for something more than shelter. He hesitated, heart pounding, mind racing through the risks. Yet as his hand rested on the doorframe, he knew what he was about to do. He would open his home to them. With a slow push, he swung the door wide, the warm light spilling out into the night. The horse lowered its massive head as though understanding the invitation. The floor creaked under its weight as it stepped inside, followed by the soft, quick movements of the foals. The rancher's home, though humble and small, became a place of impossible contrast. Wooden walls enclosing a creature that seemed too large for this world, its breath fogging the air with warmth, its presence commanding both awe and unease. The foals stumbled playfully across the room, their tiny hooves tapping against the old planks like a melody of innocence. He should have been terrified. Any man in his place would have been. Yet he wasn't. Instead, he felt something else, an odd mix of wonder and responsibility. He poured what little water he had into a basin and set it down, watching as the foals eagerly lapped it up. He broke off the last of his bread, crumbling it into smaller pieces, sharing it with trembling hands. The giant horse didn't eat. It only stood there, towering and silent, its eyes watching him with an intelligence that unsettled him, as though it carried secrets he could not yet understand. All through the night, the rancher found himself sitting near the fire, glancing at the enormous guest that now filled half his home. He wondered where it had come from, why it had chosen him of all people, and what it meant that 2 young foals had followed it here. His heart swelled with questions he dared not speak aloud. At moments he felt as though he were not the one protecting them, but that they had come to protect him instead. When the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, the rancher awoke to a strange sound, low, resonant, unlike any horse he had ever heard. The giant horse stood near the window, head lifted high, ears pricked forward, as though listening to something far beyond the walls of the house. The foals pressed close to its legs, restless and uneasy, and then, in that suspended moment, the rancher realized something unsettling. The air had grown heavier, charged, almost humming with invisible energy. His home, once a fragile shelter against hunger and cold, now felt like the center of something far larger than himself. He rose to his feet, uncertain whether to feel awe or fear. The foals whinnied softly, circling the room, bumping against chairs and overturned baskets, while the giant horse let out another sound that seemed to shake the rafters. The rancher's pulse raced as he tried to steady his thoughts. He had invited them in because of pity, because of kindness. But now, he began to wonder if this was more than an act of charity. Something about their presence felt deliberate, almost destined, as though the horse and foals had not stumbled upon his home by chance. Outside, the sky shifted colors, a strange golden haze spilling across the fields in a way he had never seen before. The rancher stepped closer to the horse, drawn by an unexplainable pull, and when their eyes met, a shiver ran through him. It wasn't just an animal looking back at him. It was something deeper, something vast and unspoken, like staring into a storm that knew your name. He swallowed hard, breath shallow as the silence thickened. The foals pressed tighter to their giant mother, their ears flicking nervously. And just when he thought the weight of the moment couldn't grow heavier, a sudden thud shook the ground beneath them. The dishes on the shelf rattled. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. The rancher froze, his heart hammering against his chest. The giant horse turned its head sharply toward the door, muscles tightening as though bracing for something unseen. The rancher's throat went dry. He had no answers, no plan, no way of knowing what was coming. All he knew was that he had taken in 3 strangers under his roof, and now the world outside seemed to be shifting in ways he couldn't explain. Whatever had led them here was not finished yet. Something unthinkable was waiting just beyond that fragile wooden door, and when it arrived, his life would never again be the same. The thud that rattled the ground did not come again, but the silence it left behind was worse. The rancher stood frozen in the dim light of his small cabin, his hand pressed against the rough wood of the wall, as though bracing himself for another tremor. The giant horse shifted its stance, hooves heavy against the planks, and the foals crowded closer to it, their soft breaths quick and nervous. The rancher's own breath came shallow, uneven. He could not tell if the sound had come from the earth itself, from some distant storm, or from something moving out there in the fields. He told himself it was probably nothing, just his mind stretching fear into shapes it didn't belong. Yet deep down he knew it was something more. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the hairs on his arms prickled, in the way the giant horse never broke its stare at the door. The morning dragged slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last. The rancher busied himself with the only tasks he could manage, piling more wood into the fireplace, patching a split along the window frame, sweeping up the hay that the foals had kicked around during the night. But no chore could distract him fully. Every time he glanced back at the horse, his heart tightened. It was simply too large, too unnatural to belong in his modest home, and yet there it stood, calm and solid, as though it had always been there. He thought about his life before this moment, a poor rancher, barely scraping by, his days spent battling the dry land and his nights spent in a quiet loneliness broken only by the sound of wind against the windows. His neighbors, few and far between, barely came by anymore. He had debts he couldn't pay, a roof that leaked whenever the storms came, and a heart that had grown used to disappointment. And yet here, in this fragile place of wood and dust, stood a creature the size of a legend with 2 foals that brought warmth and chaos to his empty rooms. Questions gnawed at him. Where had they come from? Why had they chosen his ranch, his broken-down home, when there were countless acres of wilderness to disappear into? And what was it that had shaken the ground? What force hung in the air like an unspoken warning? As the day wore on, the rancher took cautious steps outside, scanning the horizon. The sky was a pale yellow, too bright for morning, too dim for noon, and it unsettled him. The grass lay bent as though pressed down by unseen hands. Even the birds seemed absent, their usual chatter replaced by a strange stillness that followed him wherever he walked. He returned quickly, heart racing, and when he closed the door behind him, he felt a strange comfort in the sight of the horse and foals. Inside, he studied them more closely. The foals were lively, bumping into one another, their soft coats glowing faintly in the firelight. One of them approached him, nudging his hand as though asking for more food. He smiled despite his fear, rubbing its small head, feeling the warmth of its skin. The other foal stayed closer to the giant horse, its gaze fixed on him with a curiosity that felt almost human. The giant horse, however, never changed. It stood tall, unmoving, except for the slow rise and fall of its chest and the occasional flick of its ears. Its eyes followed him wherever he went, not with the dull gaze of an animal, but with the piercing weight of something that understood far more than it should. At times he almost believed it was trying to communicate, though no words were spoken, no sounds beyond the low rumble that seemed to shake the air whenever it exhaled. That night, as the rancher tried to sleep, he dreamed of fields stretching endlessly beneath a sky split in half, one side burning with golden light, the other cloaked in shadows. He saw the giant horse standing at the edge of the horizon, its foals beside it, and he saw himself there too, standing with nothing in his hands, torn between stepping forward and turning back. He woke drenched in sweat. The fire burned low and the horse still watching him from across the room. The next morning, the ground shook again. This time it was sharper, as though something massive had moved closer. The dishes rattled once more, and the foals let out startled cries, pressing against their mother's legs. The rancher gripped the edge of the table, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He wanted to run outside to see what it was, but the horse lowered its head and let out a deep, warning sound that stopped him in his tracks. It was as if the creature was telling him to stay put, to wait, to trust that leaving would only lead him into something he wasn't ready for. The hours that followed stretched into a blur of unease. He fed the foals with scraps of grain he had stored in the barn, his hands trembling as he poured the last of it into a small bucket. The horse never touched the food, never drank from the water, only stood guard as though its purpose was not to eat or rest, but to protect. Protect from what? That was the question that burned in his chest. Memories of old stories came back to him. Tales whispered by elders about creatures that wandered in times of great change, beasts that carried both warning and promise. He had never believed those tales, dismissing them as fables to pass long winters. But now, standing in his dimly lit cabin with the floor creaking beneath the weight of something that should not exist, those stories didn't feel so far-fetched anymore. By the third night, exhaustion weighed on him, yet his mind refused to quiet. He sat by the fire again, watching the shadows dance along the walls. The foals lay curled together, sleeping peacefully, but the giant horse remained awake, unmoving, its eyes reflecting the flames like dark mirrors. The rancher leaned forward, whispering into the silence. He asked it questions he knew would never be answered. Why it had come, what it wanted, what it meant for his lonely life to suddenly be tied to theirs. And though no words came back, a strange calmness settled over him, a feeling that somehow, even in the face of fear, he was no longer alone. But the peace did not last. Just before dawn, the sound returned, louder this time. Not one thud, but many. A rhythm, distant but steady, like the beating of drums across the earth. The rancher shot upright, his chest tight, as the foals bolted to their feet, whinnying in fright. The giant horse stepped forward, placing itself between the door and the foals, its body tense, its breath sharp and heavy. The ground quivered, with each beat, closer and closer, until the very walls seemed to groan under the weight of it. The rancher's pulse raced as he reached for the door, his hand trembling on the handle. He had to know. He couldn't sit in the dark and wait forever. But before he could pull it open, the horse let out a sound unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't a neigh, wasn't a cry, but something deeper, a thunderous call that seemed to echo into the very bones of the earth. The foals pressed against its legs, their eyes wide with fear, and the rancher stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. The sound outside ceased. The beating, the trembling, all of it stopped, as though silenced by the horse's command. But the silence that followed was heavier than before, carrying with it a promise that whatever had been moving closer was not gone. It was only waiting. The rancher sank into his chair, his heart still pounding, his thoughts a storm of confusion and dread. He looked at the giant horse, at the foals, at the flickering shadows on the walls of his small, fragile home, and knew one thing with painful certainty. Whatever had come to his door that night was only the beginning. Morning came thin and pale, and the rancher felt older than the night before. He fed the fire with careful hands and listened for the rhythm in the earth. It did not return, yet the cabin kept a hush that did not feel natural. The giant horse stood in its corner like a mountain, and the foals pressed against it until their Fear softened into slow breaths. The rancher had lived through lean winters and failed harvests, but this was a new kind of trial. It was not hunger or drought. It was not something he could fix with longer hours and raw grit. Whatever moved outside did not answer to effort. It answered to something else. By noon, he stepped outside and tried to make the place look alive. He replaced a sagging fence post. He checked the empty chicken coop as if it might come back to life if he stared long enough. He looked for tracks along the edge of the field. There were marks that did not match any shoe or hoof he knew. They looked like a heavy bowl had been pressed into the ground, then lifted and pressed again. Each mark was wide and shallow, the soil inside smooth like a hand had stroked it flat. He touched one and felt warmth that should not have been there. The wind moved across the grass, but the grass inside the ring did not move at all. He went back in and found the giant horse, with its head near the window, ears forward listening to a world he could not hear. He told the horse about the tracks, feeling foolish and also comforted. He told it about the warmth in the soil. He told it how the wind could not touch the marks. The horse shifted its weight and lowered its head a little, as if to say it understood. The foals bumped at his knees, and he laughed without humor and gave them what little grain he had left. He figured they could chew on the last bales of hay in the barn, and he would figure out the rest when hunger reached his own ribs again. By late afternoon, a truck rolled toward the house, dust curling behind it. The rancher's throat tightened. There were only two reasons anyone came down this road. Either they were lost or they wanted money he did not have. The truck stopped, and a man stepped out with a clipboard and a weary smile that did not reach his eyes. He looked past the rancher, into the shadowed doorway, and blinked at what he saw. The giant horse filled the frame like a shadow of a storm. The foals peered around the rancher's legs. The man tried to keep his voice even. He said he was sent by the bank. He said months had passed. He said words like interest and foreclosure and next steps. The rancher listened and felt his heart pull tight like a rope. He said he would make it right. He said he just needed time and luck. The man glanced again at the horse and cleared his throat. He said he had heard the ground was shaking along the valley. He said people were nervous. He said the sheriff was asking questions. Then he handed over a notice and climbed into the truck and drove away with more speed than the road allowed. The rancher stood in the dust and watched the road empty. He folded the paper and did not open it. Not now. He went back inside and held the paper over the fire for a second, just to feel heat lick its edge, then tucked it into a crack in the wall. The horse watched him. The foals chewed hay and made small content sounds that did not match the hollow weight in his chest. That night he dreamed of water that would not ripple. He dreamed he tossed a stone into a pond, and the stone stopped halfway down, hung in the water like a coin trapped in glass. He woke with his mouth dry and went to the bucket. The water tasted like metal. He stared into it and saw a faint shimmer move across the surface without a breeze. He poured it out and went to the well. The rope felt heavy, far heavier than a bucket should. When he pulled it up, the wind lifted for a second, then fell as if embarrassed by its own motion. The water in the bucket did not move at all, even as he set it down hard on the floor. He thought about leaving. He could drive to town, ask questions, find out what others had seen. He could bring help. He could sleep at the old motel with a blinking sign and breathe a night without the weight of the horse filling his house and the hush filling his fields. He opened the door and felt the pull of the open road like a hand on his jacket. The foals cried then, a thin sound that reached straight into him. The giant horse stepped between him and the door and kept its head low until the urge to run turned into shame. He closed the door and leaned his forehead against the wood. During the day, he worked the land he could not afford to lose. He turned the soil with a stubborn rhythm because stubborn rhythm was the thing he knew best. Each stroke of the shovel made a dull sound, as if the earth was wrapped in cloth. He planted a short row of hardy seed in defiance of the season. He tied a piece of red twine around the gate to make the place look tended. He was not a man with much, but he could stitch small proofs of effort across his life and hope they held. Near sunset, an old neighbor stopped by, a quiet figure with slow hands. He kept his eyes on the horizon and said he had heard strange things. He said his windows had fogged on the inside, and the clocks had all paused at the same time, then started, again without being wound. He said the cattle up the ridge had moved into tight circles around nothing at all. The rancher listened and nodded and did not invite him in. The neighbor looked at the door once and then looked away. He told the rancher about a story from his grandmother, a tale about a guardian beast that came when the land bent under a hidden weight. He said the story carried two endings. In one, the guardian left once the land was righted. In the other, the guardian left because the land was beyond saving. The neighbor spit into the dust and said he hoped they were living inside the first ending. Then he tipped his hat and walked back the way he came. That night the drums returned. Not sound, not really, but a pressure that felt like sound. The foals woke and trembled. The rancher lit the lantern and stood by the window. The giant horse walked to the door and tapped a hoof once, a sound that felt like a question. The rancher unlatched the door and stepped onto the porch. The world lay under a thin light that came from no moon. The field was a sheet of dim gold. At the edge of his property something moved. It did not move like an animal. It moved like a thought that had weight. He went as far as the fence and set both hands on a post. The air had a smell he could not name, cold and sweet and full of rain that did not fall. He wanted to call out, to say words a person would say to another person. He said them anyway. He said he did not want trouble. He said he wanted to keep his home. He said these animals were safe with him. The thing at the edge of the field paused, and the ground softened. The giant horse sounded off from the porch, a low note that ran through the boards and into the fence and up the rancher's arms. The pressure backed away. The light thinned to a normal night. The rancher felt knees he had not noticed, and leaned on the fence until his breath evened. He turned and saw the horse framed in the doorway, and a thought surprised him. The thought said this was a conversation, even if he did not know the words. He went back inside and shut the door and slid the heavy bar across. The next day brought a smaller but harder problem. A letter from town said the road crews would be grading the valley route and closing the only cut-through to the feed store. He had one bale of hay left and a few armfuls of straw. He did not know how long the strange hush would last or how long the foals would need him. He walked to the barn and measured the bales like a miser counts coins. He cut the twine and stretched, feed by mixing in dry weeds and a handful of cracked corn he had been saving for his own table. He watched the foals eat and told them plans he did not believe. He told them about a man in town who might trade on credit. He told them about a ridge path that might not be closed. He told them about luck turning like a wheel eventually. Around midday, he found a patch of ground near the well where the grass had deepened from green to almost black. He knelt and parted it with his fingers. The soil underneath was glossy and cool. If he held still, he could hear a low murmur like water running through stone, far underground. He brought a small trowel and dug a narrow slit. Inside the slit, something gleamed. It looked like wet mica. It looked like a mirror. He reached for it, and the giant horse made a sharp sound from the doorway that stopped his hand. He stood fast, heart hammering with a small shame that felt like getting caught stealing from a kitchen. He filled the slit again and patted the soil smooth. The horse quieted. As the sun lowered, another truck came, slower than the last. The sheriff climbed out with careful steps and stood with his hands on his belt. He asked if the rancher had felt the tremors. He asked if he had seen any flashlights in the hills. He asked if he kept unusual animals. The rancher said the ground had moved, and the nights had been strange. He said he had taken in 2 foals and a large horse. The sheriff stepped to the doorway and froze. He took a breath he tried to hide. He said he would file a note. He said some folks wanted the valley cleared if the shaking got worse. He said there were men in town who would come with papers and push everything into a new plan if they had to. He said he did not want that. He asked the rancher to be careful. Then he backed away the way people back away from cliffs. The rancher watched the truck go and felt the conflict sharpen into something that had edges. This was not only about the hush in the air or the marks in the soil. It was about people who had maps and paperwork. It was about a bank that had waited long enough. It was about a valley that did not belong to those who loved it most. It was about whether he could stand inside his thin walls and keep the world from taking what little he still had. He pulled the paper from the crack in the wall and held it. He thought about fire again, He slid the notice back and told himself there were battles you could not fight with flames. During the next 2 days, small things shifted. The foals learned the corners of the house and stopped bumping into chairs. The giant horse found a spot where the floor did not creak and stood there for hours like a sentry. The rancher learned how to sleep in short slices and wake at the first change in the air. He learned that if he sang under his breath while sweeping, the pressure in the room eased a little. He learned that if he stood at the fence at dawn, the marks in the field did not come closer. He did not know if these things were true, or if he was telling himself stories to make the edges of fear round enough to hold. On the third evening, a child's kite drifted in from the ridge, torn loose from some small hand. It hung in the low branches by the barn. The rancher freed it and held it up to the light. The horse watched him, and the foals nudged his hip. He tied the kite to a post and let it lift just enough to tug. He thought a simple thing might teach the air to move again. The kite pulled, and for a moment a breeze ran past the porch and set the hair on his arms dancing. He smiled, a real smile that hurt his face. Then the line went slack without breaking, and the kite hung like a flag on a still day. That night the pressure returned in waves, softer but steady. The rancher stood with his back to the fire and his hands open at his sides. The foals pressed against him. The giant horse lifted its head and looked past the walls as if the walls were an idea and not wood. For one long minute the cabin felt like the middle of a wide ring. The rancher felt watched. He felt weighed. He felt asked a question he still did not know how to answer. He whispered that he would not give them up. He whispered that he did not have much, but he had that one promise, and he could keep it. Outside, something shifted in reply. The marks in the field widened. The fence leaned an inch. The bucket by the door hummed without moving. The rancher let the fear move through him and not around him. He stood straighter and set his jaw, and felt the old, stubborn rhythm take hold again. He could not make rain. He could not change a bank ledger. He could not name the shape that moved at the edge of his land. He could decide to stand. He could decide to keep the door open to the animals that had chosen his poor home as a harbor. The night settled but did not sleep. The giant horse did not step away from the door. The foals breathed slow in the circle of his arms. The rancher's eyes burned and his back ached, and he did not move. Somewhere beyond his fields, men were drawing lines on papers, and the ground itself was drawing lines he could not see. The conflict did not wait for him to be ready. It pressed in, patient and sure, asking him to choose long before he knew what the cost would be. He did not answer with words. He answered by holding his place until the lamp burned low, and the first line of gray touched the window and the next round began. The rancher woke before dawn, though he could not say if he had truly slept. His body was heavy, his mind caught between dream and waking. He stepped to the window and looked out at the fields, and for the first time he saw the marks clearly in the thin gray light. They were no longer scattered or random. They formed a rough circle around his land, wide and uneven, but closing like a tightening rope. His stomach turned as he realized they had grown larger, each one wide enough now for a wagon wheel to fit. Inside, he pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The air was cool but carried no freshness. It felt stale, like air trapped in a cellar for years. His eyes followed the circle until the distance blurred. Whatever moved out there was not just passing through, it was closing in. He set his hands on the fence rail and felt the wood tremble under his touch, though the air was still. From the cabin came the sound of the foals crying softly. He turned back, and the giant horse stood in the doorway, its head bowed low, its eyes locked on him as if asking what choice he would make. By mid-morning, the valley was restless. The ground quivered every so often, never enough to knock anything down, but enough to keep a man's nerves raw. The rancher tried to work, tried to busy himself with chores, but his tools slipped in his hands. Every sound seemed sharper. The crows that usually circled overhead were nowhere to be seen. The silence pressed down until even the wind seemed unwilling to stir. Toward noon, dust appeared on the far road. Another truck. He felt a heaviness in his chest as it drew closer. When it stopped, 3 men climbed out. 2 wore jackets with the bank's seal stitched on, and the third was the sheriff again. They looked at the ranch, then at the cabin, and their faces shifted when they saw the horse through the open door. The foals peeked from behind its legs, and for a moment even these hard men hesitated. The sheriff spoke first. He said the tremors had reached town. He said windows were breaking on Main Street, and people wanted answers. The men from the bank said the land was unstable, unsafe, and that nobody could live here. They handed him a new set of papers, thicker than the last, stamped with bold red letters that told him what he already knew. His home, his land, the last of what he had left, was no longer his in their eyes. The rancher did not take the papers. He said he would not leave. His voice was calm, but inside he shook like the earth beneath him. One of the men stepped closer, his mouth tight with impatience. He said the rancher was being foolish, that nothing was worth dying for. Not this place, not a few broken down acres. He nodded toward the horse and said it was dangerous, unnatural, and that it needed to be moved or put down before it caused more panic. The giant horse lifted its head then and let out a low, rolling sound that made the air vibrate. The men stepped back quickly, their bravado stripped bare. The sheriff held out a hand urging calm, but his own eyes betrayed unease. The rancher stood taller, though his knees threatened to buckle. He said the horse and foals were staying, and if they wanted to move them, they would have to move him first. The men exchanged looks, and finally the sheriff spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. He said they would return not with talk but with force if need be. Then they left, the truck's engine rattling down the road until the dust swallowed them whole. The rancher stood in the silence afterward, his chest burning, his throat tight. He knew the time for delay was gone. The conflict was no longer waiting. It was coming for him in more ways than one. That night the tremors returned stronger. Plates slid off the shelves and shattered. The foals bolted across the room, their small bodies trembling. The rancher tried to calm them, but the horse pushed forward, placing itself between him and the door again. Its eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, and its breath came out in heavy gusts that sounded almost like words. The rancher pressed a hand against its neck, and for a heartbeat he thought he felt an image move through him, not a sound, but a vision of the land cracking open, of something vast and heavy pressing upward from below. He pulled away, shaken, and stumbled to his chair. He stared at the horse, at the foals, at the fragile walls of his home, and wondered how he could possibly fight what he did not understand. Yet when the thought of leaving crossed his mind, the foals bleated softly, and the horse's gaze pinned him where he stood. He knew then that leaving was no longer an option. His choice had already been made. Over the next days, the circle in the field deepened. The marks became trenches. Dark soil churned into strange shapes that seemed to breathe when the light shifted. The well water turned cloudy. The cattle from neighboring lands were herded away, their owners too afraid to stay near. By the third evening, even the sky looked different, the clouds moving in patterns that did not match the wind. The rancher tried to prepare, though he did not know for what. He moved what food he had into one pile, filled buckets with water, though the taste had gone bitter, and stacked firewood until his arms gave out. The horse never left the doorway. The foals stayed close to him, as if sensing that the world outside had grown hostile. At night he lay awake, listening to the heavy steps circling his land, closer each time, as if testing the limits of his will. On the 5th night the air grew thick, so thick it felt like he was breathing through cloth. The lantern light dimmed, without running out of oil. The sound of the drums returned, louder than ever, shaking the very beams of the cabin. The foals wailed, the horse stamped its hooves, and the rancher felt the floor bend beneath him. He staggered outside, desperate for air, and what he saw stopped his breath cold. At the far edge of his land, along the circle of marks, shadows rose from the soil. They were not shaped like animals, not shaped like men, but something in between. Tall, bent figures, their outlines rippling as though made of smoke, yet heavy enough to sink into the earth with each step. They moved slowly, steadily, forming a ring around the ranch, their heads turning in unison toward his cabin. The rancher stumbled back a step, his hands trembling. He whispered a prayer he had not spoken in years, though his voice cracked halfway through. The giant horse stepped out onto the porch behind him, its size blotting out the light of the cabin. It let out another sound, louder than before, a call that made the shadows pause. The foals pressed against the doorway, their cries, thin but sharp, carrying into the night. The shadows did not retreat. They swayed, then stepped closer, the ground trembling with each movement. The rancher felt the air pulse against his chest, as though his very heart was being counted by the rhythm of their steps. His knees weakened, but he stood his ground, one hand gripping the fence rail, the other clenched into a fist. Far off, the sound of engines echoed. The sheriff, the men from the bank, maybe more. Headlights cut faint lines against the dark horizon. The rancher's fear twisted into something else, anger, defiance, a raw heat that burned away his doubts. He was caught between two forces, now, one from beyond the earth, the other from the world of men, and both were closing in. His small home, his fragile claim, stood at the center of a storm he could no longer escape. The horse stepped down from the porch and into the dirt, its hooves striking sparks as though the ground itself resisted. The foals cried again, higher, sharper, their small bodies shaking but unwilling to leave their mother's side. The rancher watched as the horse's breath poured into the night like smoke, its body glowing faintly as if fire lived beneath its skin. The shadows pressed closer. The headlights drew nearer. The ground shook so hard the posts of the fence tilted, and the air carried a low hum that felt like it could shatter bone. The rancher braced himself, every nerve alive, every fear clawing at him, yet some deeper part of him steadied. He knew the moment he had dreaded was here, the point where all choices converged, where the world would split open and demand his answer. He tightened his grip on the fence and forced himself not to blink, not to look away, as the shadows reached the edge of his land, as the truck engines roared up the road, as the giant horse reared back, towering higher than he had ever seen. The foals cried out together, their voices raw, desperate, as though calling not just to him, but to whatever. Power lingered in the dark. The night hung heavy, the air vibrating with a tension so thick it felt alive. The rancher's breath came in ragged bursts, his heart pounding loud enough to drown out every other sound. He knew the climax was near, that something immense was about to break, and that whatever happened next would decide not just his fate, but the fate of everything that had dared to step inside this circle of earth. The night split open with sound and light. The giant horse reared high, its hooves slamming the earth so hard the ground rippled like water. Sparks flew in arcs around, its body and a glow poured from its skin, spilling across the field in waves. The foals shrieked, their cries sharp as arrows. The rancher gripped the fence until his hands bled, watching as the shadows pressed forward, only to stumble against the light that radiated from the horse's chest. The men's truck skidded to a stop at the edge of the property. Doors slammed. The sheriff shouted something, his voice lost in the thunder of hooves and the roar of engines. The bankers froze when they saw what rose from the earth in front of them. The shadow figures twisted in fury, their shapes bending like smoke caught in a storm. They threw themselves against the circle of light, but each time they struck, the glow pushed them back, their forms unraveling a little more. The rancher realized then that the horse had not come to him for shelter. It had come to anchor this fight. The foals pressed against each other, their small bodies glowing faintly now, as though they carried the same fire inside them. He stepped toward them, his fear still sharp, but his heart steadier. He whispered to them, telling them they were safe, telling them he would not leave. And for the first time since the tremors began, he believed his own words. The sheriff pushed through the dust, his hand reaching out. His eyes were wide with both terror and awe. He asked what was happening, his voice breaking under the strain. The rancher turned to him and said this land was alive, older than their maps, older than their banks. He said the horse and the foals were not monsters but guardians. He said the earth had been calling for help, and they had answered. The sheriff stood frozen, the bankers pale and trembling, the truck's headlights flickering as the ground shook beneath them. The circle of shadows tried once more. They surged as one, their shapes rising higher, blotting out the stars. The horse roared, a sound so deep the rancher felt it inside his chest. Light burst outward, slamming into the figures and tearing them apart. They shredded into strands of dark mist that whirled into the sky and vanished with a hiss like steam on hot iron. The earth went still. The air cleared. The silence returned. But this time it was clean, not heavy. The circle in the soil faded, the trenches smoothing over as if hands of invisible workers pressed them flat. The horse lowered its head, breath rolling in steady waves. The foals quieted, curling near the porch. The glow in their bodies dimmed to a faint shimmer before settling back into ordinary light. The rancher touched the giant horse's neck, his hand steady now. He whispered thanks, though he knew words were too small for what had just passed. Behind him, the banker stammered, their papers forgotten in the dirt. They muttered about reports and danger and things no man would believe. The sheriff looked at them, then back at the rancher, and shook his head. He told the bankers they had seen enough, and if they valued their lives, they would walk away. His voice carried weight now, the weight of a man who had faced something larger than law or ledger. The bankers argued, but their fear betrayed them. They climbed back into the truck and left, dust trailing their retreat. The sheriff lingered. He asked the rancher what he would do now. The rancher said he would stay. This was his home, poor as it was, and he would not leave it to rot. The sheriff nodded slowly. He said he would do what he could to keep the valley quiet, to keep the curious away. Then he left, leaving the rancher, the horse, and the foals alone with the night. Days passed, and the land grew calmer. The tremors faded until they were only faint memories. The soil returned to its old texture, rich and dark as if it had been renewed. The water from the well cleared and ran cool, fresher than it had in years. Grass grew thicker around the barn and the fences held firm. It was as though the land had been tested and found its strength again. The rancher worked it with care, planting seeds in neat rows, his body aching but his spirit lightened. The giant horse stayed a while longer. Each night it stood guard at the door, silent and steady, while the foals grew bolder, chasing each other across the fields. The rancher found himself laughing again, a sound that felt foreign but welcome. He fed them with what he had, and when supplies ran low, neighbors brought feed without asking for money. Some said they had felt the tremors end the night the ranch lit up and they knew something had shifted. They did not ask questions. They left food, tools, and quiet blessings. One morning the horse stepped into the field and lifted its head high. The foals followed, their coats shining in the sun. The rancher watched, a lump in his throat, as the horse turned to him one last time. Its eyes met his, and in that gaze he felt a promise, a bond that would not break even if distance grew between them. Then, with the foals at its side, it walked to the far ridge. The light seemed to bend around them, and in the blink of an eye, they were gone. The ranch stood quiet again, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was full of peace. The rancher carried on. He repaired the roof, planted his fields, and kept the memory of that night close. When neighbors asked about the glow, he only said, the land had healed itself. When the sheriff stopped by, they shared coffee in silence, neither man needing to put words to what they had seen. The bankers did not return. The papers that had once threatened his home were never spoken of again. Perhaps they had learned that some debts cannot be measured in numbers. As the seasons turned, the ranch thrived in ways it had not for years. Crops grew tall, the soil rich and generous. The air felt lighter, as though a burden had lifted from the valley. At night, the rancher would stand at his fence, looking at the stars, and sometimes he swore he saw movement along the ridge, the faint outline of a great horse watching from afar. He never forgot the weight of that night, the way the ground shook and the air burned, the way he thought he might break. But he also never forgot the strength he found inside himself. The choice he made to stand when running might have been easier. That choice, more than anything, became the heart of his days. He was no longer just a poor rancher with debts and broken fences. He was the man who had stood with guardians, who had faced shadows and refused to yield. In the end, the story was not only about a giant horse or the strange tremors. It was about a man who discovered what he still had worth holding on to, even when the world pressed hard against him. It was about land that had been scarred and healed, and about a bond between human and creature that could not be explained, but could be felt. It was about defiance, about hope, about the quiet power of standing firm when all else trembles. Years later, when the rancher's hair had turned white, children from nearby farms would ask him about the night the sky glowed. He would smile, his eyes bright, and tell them the land was alive, and if they cared for it, it would care for them. He would tell them about a horse too large to fit through a doorway, and two foals that played in his kitchen. He would leave, out the darker parts, but the lesson always remained. Some things are worth standing for no matter the cost. The cabin stood, weathered but proud, the fields stretching wide and green. And though the horse and foals never returned, the rancher felt them always in the strength of the soil, in the calm of the nights, in the quiet hum of the earth beneath his feet. He knew he had been given a gift, not of wealth or ease, but of meaning, and that was enough. When he closed his eyes at night, he could still hear the echo of hooves, steady and strong, carrying him forward into peace. And as the stars wheeled, above the valley, the ranch slept sound, held safe by a promise that would never fade. Top of form, bottom of form,